Before we do go on to that other method of per VLAN load balancing, I wanted to review the STP port states because I know we've mentioned them here, there, and everywhere in the last couple of videos. But let's go over each of them and make sure we know what's going on and what's not going on in each particular state. Now, there's one odd STP port state called disabled. And it's a little odd in that you will not see DIS next to a port in the output of show spanning VLAN. But Cisco considers it to be an official STP state, so we will as well. A disabled port is simply a port that's been administratively shut down. A disabled port isn't forwarding frames, it's really not doing much of anything, it's not even really officially running STP. Now once that port is administratively enabled, the port goes into blocking state, BLK. The port still can't do much at that point. There's no frame forwarding going on, there's no frame receiving, certainly, no dynamic learning of MAC addresses. But what it can do, the big difference between disabled and blocking, is that a blocked port can accept BPDUs from neighboring switches. Now, as we saw a couple of times, and I'll show again here on the board, when a port starts that transition from blocking to forwarding, it doesn't go immediately to forwarding. The first state it goes into from blocking is called listening. Now the obvious question is, listening for what? Well, a listening port is listening for BPDUs, and a listening port can send them as well, which allows the port to participate in the root bridge election. We saw in one of the labs, or a couple of them actually, when we changed a port cost to 9, whether it was for all VLANs or for just one, the port that had been the alternate port immediately went to root as a role, even though it hadn't gone all the way to forwarding for status. You don't have to wait that long. Now, a port in listening mode still can't forward or receive frames, and as a result, that port cannot learn MAC addresses. Now, as that transition continues, the port goes from listening to learning mode, LRN. A learning port isn't forwarding frames yet, but it is learning MAC addresses and adding them to the switch's MAC address table. And a port in learning mode continues to send and receive BPDUs. Finally, the port goes from learning to forwarding mode. That's what we're looking for. Forwarding mode allows the port to forward and receive frames, send and receive BPDUs, and continue to learn MAC addresses. This is the only state where the port is actually forwarding frames. So a quick review there of the STP port states for you. As we move back to this thing about per VLAN load balancing with the port priority command. You remember that list way back when we used for root port selection? First the switch will choose the port receiving the superior BPDU. If there's a tie, then it'll choose the port with the lowest root path cost. If there's still a tie, then we'll choose the port receiving the BPDU with the lowest sender bid. And then if it's still tied, we'll choose the lowest sender port ID. Yeah, that one. Thought I'd remind you of it before we went on with this lab. Because that port ID, we didn't really talk about it, but it's a combination of the port priority and the port number. And during that lab, we had a couple of ports sending BPDUs on switch 1 and that prio period NBR at the end, 128.11 and 128.12. That's the priority that we're actually going to be changing. And we can also change the port priority of a port to make it lower than another port and start doing some per VLAN load balancing. What we're going to do this time is a little backwards from the last one. We want VLANs 10 and 20 to use the trunk over the fast 12 ports, the trunk using the fast 12 ports at the endpoints. 30 and 40, they're going to stay the same. They're going to stay on the default. And I did remove the commands from the last lab before starting this one. So you can see here just for VLAN 30 that everything's back to the normal, back to the default, I should say, where we're using fast 11 for the forwarding and fast 12 is being blocked. And I will go ahead and run that for 40 just for fun, and the exact same thing. So now we're going to change this for VLANs 10 and 20. So let's go ahead and get started with that. We'll go right back to fast 012. We should be able to up arrow over some of this, yep. But we're going to do VLANs 10 and 20 this time. And we're going to use the port priority command. And watch this one because you have to put it in increments of 16. One of those things. So we're going to say 16. We could go 0, but I'm going to go 16. And I believe that's it for the options. So there we go. Changed it. Little config message, no big deal there. And let's go ahead and change or check What's going on here? Well, this is for VLAN 1, so everything's the same. We expect that. Let's go to VLAN 10. And the priority changed. We can see that immediately. What we don't see is anything changing as far as the status goes. We did say 10 and 20, right? Let's check my command. Spanning VLAN 1020, port priority 16. Everything looks good there. What about port VLAN 20 then? Okay, well, we can see the priority did change, but the root port is still staying at 11. Just for fun, we'll check 30 out. And just for even less fun, we'll check 40 out. And we're still not seeing anything. We don't see a change. And of course, we don't see a change in the priority on VLANs 30 and 40 because we didn't change the priorities on VLANs 30 and 40. So our concern here is, why isn't this changing? We see the priority changing, but we don't see the root port changing. We don't see any change in the selection process. I'm sure you noticed that I bolded a certain word in that list. Lowest sender port ID. If switch 2 is receiving those BPDUs from switch 1, and it has to be because that's the only other switch in our network, then we need to go to switch 1 and change the priority. It's not doing us any good to change the priority on the recipient switch. It has to be on the sending switch, which in this case, of course, would be switch 1. So let's go ahead, first off, do a little housekeeping. And we will take this command off. And I use a Control A to do that. I'm not real big on a lot of keyboard shortcuts. If you use them, beautiful, to each their own. But I do like that one, Control A, because it moves the cursor all the way to the front of the line, and then just put a word no in there to negate that. And let's go ahead and run show spanning VLAN 10. We can see the priority's gone right back to 128. And we'll do so for 20. And it's back at 128. So now let's hop over to switch 1. And we will run that same command. And we will use 1020 here. And there's port priority. And there's our increment of 16. And then that's it. Let's see if we get any messages on the root besides configure from console. I don't think we will. But let's go over to switch 2 now. Run show spanning VLAN 10. And you see the change immediately. Now I will go back to switch 1 and verify the actual change, but I wanted to show you this before the process went too far. You can see immediately port 11 went into blocking mode. Port 12 is already in listening mode. So the change we made has taken effect. We just didn't make it at the right place at the first attempt. So we've got it in learning now. It should be in forwarding. There we go. So it looks good. And now let's go back over to switch 1. VLAN 10. And there we go. There's our priority change. Nothing's going to change over here as far as a port selection because, of course, this is our root anyway. But there's the key. You really got to watch that one because it's so easy to change it on the local switch and say, oh, okay. But when you're using port priority to work with this list of criteria and you're going to change that sender port ID, remember, it has to be the sender port ID. So those are two great ways for load balancing. We used the cost command on a per VLAN basis, then we used port priority on a per VLAN basis. So take a deep breath. I know that's a lot of labs right in a row, and I'll see you on the very next video.